All right, so once again, welcome. So excited to have you all here this afternoon, and really glad to have three phenomenal community members join us today. Professor Christopher Liang from the College of Education, and then we have Jen Ocampo and Jessica Munn, who will be helping to facilitate the conversation as OMA ambassadors in our office. The conversation today is on Invisible at the Margins, a frank talk on the history of intersectional anti-Asian violence and resistance. So I'm going to turn it over to our guest speakers today, and I hope that you all not only enjoy but learn from the conversation. Such a timely and important conversation to have today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Clara. I am Chris Liang, and for those of you who don't know me, I am a professor of counseling psychology and in the College of Education. And I want to just start off by thanking OMA, Clara, and Chad for creating a space weekly and this particular week for us to have these types of conversations. And I want to just thank everyone for joining us. I recognize that everyone's so super busy. And so it means a lot to see all the faces on the screen. Before I go any further, I want to say that my focus on anti-Asian violence, our focus on anti-Asian violence is not meant to take away the much needed attention to efforts to counter anti-Blackness or anti-racism. They're all connected. It is not my intention to compare the experiences of Asian Americans with other groups, particularly African Americans and Indigenous people who've experienced incredible amounts of racial injustice in this country throughout history. And in particular, as we sit through the trial of George Floyd's murderer. And I'm intentionally centering the name of the victim and not the perpetrator, the murderer. I'm simply here to bring voice to the Asian American experience. And I'm so happy and thrilled to have met Jen and Jessica out of their busy schedules as students to engage in this labor. So just a quick warning, some of today's content, can be triggering to some folks. So if you need support, please visit the university's counseling center. If you're a student, please, make use of their services. I'm going to start with a story that is challenging, but important to hear. Perhaps some of you read this story. But speaking of a brutal attack on a 65-year-old Filipino woman, an excerpt from the New York Times reported, quote, she crumpled to the sidewalk. He kicked her once in the head, then again and again. He yelled an obscenity at her, according to a police official, and then said, "You don't belong here." As the violent scene unfolded in Manhattan, 3 men watched from the lobby of a nearby luxury apartment building. And though all the details are still in dispute, when the woman struggled to stand up, one of the men, a security guard, closed the front door of the building. We don't know all the details, but that's what's been reported. That's, if I think too hard about it, if I actually slow down and listen to myself, read that, I've got a lot of feelings about that, as I'm sure many of you do as well. And I know a good number of my colleagues, they watch the video. I can't watch videos of people getting murdered. I just cannot. It's too traumatizing. Now, well, here's what's important. That excerpt is dated March 30th, 2021, just 2 weeks after the horrific murders of 8 individuals, including 6 women of Asian descent at 3 different Asian spas in Atlanta. I share this not to add more trauma, right, particularly to Asian Americans, but I just want to point this out. This event happened just 2 weeks after, the mass shootings in Atlanta. Well, on the morning after that shooting, at about 7:30 a.m., I was pretty upset, along with many people on this call, and particularly Asian Americans. And I wanted to contribute to countering the invisibility of the APIA community. So I emailed Chad with the request to chat here today. And Chad, with his allyship and grace, immediately agreed to hosting this conversation hour. I think he could sense that I was a little upset. I may have told him I'm upset, but we agreed that I would take some time, before moving forward with the conversation. My feelings were very raw then, and they're still raw now. They're at the surface. I'm going to be real honest with you. And so we're here today, having this conversation with Jennifer and Jessica and the rest of you. I've got some content to cover. Jen has some content to cover, and so does Jessica. And then we're going to have some time for conversation, because that's the purpose of this conversation hour. But there is a lot to unpack. So I contacted Chad a couple of weeks ago because I couldn't stomach the violence, and had a good guess that other people of Asian descent, US born and international students, might be feeling, alone in this, that they might feel, as I do, that there is a thick, choking blanket of silence that has enveloped us as a country. We don't talk about these things, particularly as they concern Asian Americans. You see, like, a lot of folks may have been paying attention after Atlanta, but a good number of Asian and Asian American students, faculty, and staff have been paying attention to the news of violence directed toward elders and women since that former president of ours labeled and continued to use the vile racist terms to describe the coronavirus. Now, these terms were not his creation. He simply seized on over 150 years of racist yellow peril tropes that have plagued this country and Asian Americans specifically. His words stoked and gave permission to people fueled by misinformation and hate. He got them to direct their rage and fears onto Asian Americans. You see, as horrible as the murders would have been as a one-off event, this is unfortunately just another act in a string of close to 3,800 acts of anti-Asian violence that's been reported to Stop AAPI Hate between March 19th, 2020 and February 28th, 2021. Now, I'm not sure how that's sitting with you all as listeners. That's about 10 a day. And it's an undercounting of what's going on the streets. I know of several people who've been attacked in New York City subways and in the San Francisco Bay Area and in other communities that haven't reported, even at my suggesting and request. It's their choice, obviously, but this is an undercounting. So some people of Asian descent, because we know these things are going on, we've been sitting for over a year with deep concern and fear for the safety of our loved ones, for ourselves, this entire year. I've changed some of my own behaviors and patterns of exercise even, because yes, the violence has been disproportionately directed toward women, but I'm not foolish enough to believe that someone wouldn't attack me if I were running. That's happened to Black men as early as last year, right? Ahmaud Arbery. We know that. So these are the types of things that are happening. And so I just want to say this meeting today is not about the murders in Atlanta. It's much more than that. The purpose of today's discussion is to unpack just a bit some of the factors that are contributing to the increase in year-to-year reported hate. But Jennifer, Jessica, and I, we didn't struggle, but we had a conversation. What did we want to do with this space? Was it for healing for Asian Americans, for Asian students? Was it to build understanding, allyship, or both, right? So much is needed. And on behalf of Jennifer and Jessica, I just want to recognize that we will only scratch the surface today with the amount of time that we have. Now, I know that healing or a space to process the feelings may be needed still for folks of Asian descent. Just a couple weekends ago, I co-led a healing session, and there was so much hurt and pain in over the 70 attendees. And not just over the violence, that hurts, but the silence. And I imagine some folks on this campus, perhaps some folks on this call of Asian descent, feel the same way, and they could use some space to heal. And I hope that the talk today can provide some of that healing. And I hope today that today's talk breaks some of the silence and allows people to heal just a little bit. Now, Jennifer, Jessica, and I did decide to focus on education and allyship. And I think we came to this conclusion because of how Asian Americans have been rendered invisible. Invisible. We don't typically think about their experiences of dehumanization or their contributions to the United States. But with over 50 years of scholarship within standalone Asian American studies programs in this country, we know that there is a lot of history to learn, right? I'm not part of an Asian American studies program. I taught in an Asian American studies program 20 years ago, but I haven't taught in that field in a long time, but that field is rich with knowledge. Asian American studies scholarship provides critical analysis of race relations, of how Asian Americans who represent over 30 diverse ethnic groups, including Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Filipino, Hmong, Thai, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, just to name a few. How they fit within the black-white binary. It's a huge group, and we're tired of the invisibility. Now, the field of Asian American studies contextualizes the trauma of lynchings of Asians. The internment of Japanese Americans, the riots and burnings of Chinatowns. And the violence and murders of Southeast Asians. During and after the Vietnamese War. The violence of anyone mistaken for being Japanese American, of being Japanese during the time of economic competition with the Japanese, and more recently of South Asians and Arab Americans after 9/11. And of course now of Asian Americans during this past year. Sorry for, I'm not going to apologize actually, I'm getting emotional. And now the field is highly intellectual, and it addresses the many ways that racism has been experienced by Asian Americans, not just the violence that I'm talking about, that I talked about, that I couldn't get through without crying, but the institutionalized types of racism through legislation like the Page Law, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and alien land laws. The field is not just about trauma, though, and it's not just about racist legislation, it's also about stories of survival and contribution, right? I bring up Asian American studies because if we want to heal, if we want to really know as a community, then we need to be able to know what Asian American studies is. We need to know what Asian Americans go through in this country. Because all of that has been conveniently erased from our history. We don't talk about it, we don't think about it, and when we don't talk about them and we don't think about them, it's a whole lot easier to dehumanize them and to do violence onto them. But Asian Americans have been critical in the development of this country, the agricultural system, our science and technology, commerce, the transcontinental railroad, all of it, contributions by Asian Americans. And you know what also? Through the legal challenges levied by Asian Americans in the courts, how the 14th Amendment has been applied to other people of color and people generally. There's a lot to know. And I'm sorry that to my Asian American brothers and sisters that I couldn't get through it without getting emotional. But I do hope that just a brief overview of the contributions can provide some fertile ground from which healing can grow, right? Now, Jennifer, Jessica, and I decided to focus our attention on highlighting just several key constructs within Asian American studies to unpack. Just a couple. We decided that Jennifer would discuss the model minority myth, which is often used to disregard the needs of Asian Americans, while also serving as a device for white supremacy. It pits people against one another. It pits Asian American people against their Black and brown siblings. Jessica will talk a bit about perpetual foreigner stereotype, which directly links the past and the present day experiences of anti-Asian violence in the US. They have led talks on these topics before, and we decided that they would do it again, but with a focus on the Atlanta shootings and more broadly, white supremacy. So before we build out some of the knowledge and engage in conversation, I think it's critically important that we consider anti-Asian violence within the context of white supremacy and capitalism, which is the root of racism directed toward all BIPOC communities. I also encourage people to consider how white supremacy and white racist ideology is internalized by even the most seemingly caring of people, including people of color. And I encourage us to think about the current anti-Asian racism from an intersectional perspective. An intersectional perspective in this case is attention to how women and elderly are disproportionately attacked and how gendered racism operates in such a way to sexualize and objectify Asian and Asian American women. It's not an invitation for men to take a benevolent position of protector, right? Instead, it's an invitation to men to interrogate how masculinity operates within themselves, their brothers, and in our culture in ways that promote and normalize violence. Because you know what? After Atlanta, we had 2 weekends of mass shootings by men. Because even, without this focus on race, we need to focus on men and the things that trigger them and get them to engage in violent behaviors, whether it's sexual violence, gun violence, racial violence, violence towards LGBTQ people. We need to be able to identify the targets of our intervention. So with that, I'm sorry, Jennifer, I went a little long, but I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Hi, everyone. So as been stated, I had done a talk on the model minority myth. I do not want to spend like a really long time explaining the history of the myth, just so we can have space for discussion, but I do want to give a brief background of it. Once I'm finished speaking, I will also drop a link to the video I did show during my real talk, if you wish to watch it during your own time, because I think it really explains the history of the model minority myth and how it came to be as what we identify it and how it's still seen today. So the model minority myth is the ideology that Asian Americans are inherently smart, successful, polite, and obedient. In a history sense, white America handpicked smart and successful Asian immigrants and allowed them into America, and then turned around and said, wow, Asians are really smart and successful. This caused the idea that all Asians are rich and successful, which is not true. Asian Americans have the largest wealth inequality gap out of every racial group in the United States. And it also raises this monolith idea of Asians when, as Chris stated, there are over 30 diverse ethnic groups getting thrown under the umbrella of Asian American. It is also important to note that the model minority myth was created in a place of white supremacy to create a wedge between communities, to essentially point fingers and say, if they can do it, why can't you? While ignoring the differences of treatment and history of each community. I want to emphasize that the model minority myth only benefits white supremacy. It is not a compliment to the Asian community, but instead harmful. To quote Nora Liang from the San Diego Union Tribune, it imposes a rigid set of respectable rules upon Asian Americans under the guise of a compliment, while simultaneously demeaning Asian Americans who don't follow the accepted rules, and other races such as African Americans who are then compared to the model minority, creating a social hierarchy upheld through discrimination. The model minority myth has a place in this discussion about the violence against Asians because this idea that Asians are obedient and polite and will not rock the boat forces them to be silent. To quote Caden Mack, the executive director of the Asian American organization group 18 Million Rising, people don't think Asians will fight back, so it's easy to target people who you don't think you'll have consequences for targeting. Violence against Asians has been happening for a long time. It became more apparent when COVID-19 first became a problem in America, but it did not start there. These violent acts being silent says that Asian Americans are not worthy of attention because the model minority myth raises the idea that they have no problems due to being seen as inherently wealthy and successful. Another topic that needs to be discussed in this conversation is the perpetual foreigner syndrome that Jessica is going to speak on.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica. I gave a real talk about perpetual foreigner syndrome a few weeks ago, but on that real talk, I mainly focus on how the individuals are affected by the syndrome, but I think it's also important to address how perpetual foreigner syndrome also affects the group by othering Asians and Asian Americans and grouping all Asians into one foreign group. It very easily leads to dehumanization. Individual identities are erased. Asian women are reduced to hypersexualized and fetishized objects. Asian men are emasculated, and all Asians are seen as incapable of facing discrimination and oppression. And it's generalizations like these that make violence and hate crimes more likely to happen because they're just not seen as humans like other people. And I think it's also important to recognize that perpetual foreigner stereotypes is also created through intersectional forms of discrimination. The shootings of 8 women, 6 of them being Asian women, the elderly being beaten and killed on the streets. You have to see that this is beyond just race. It's also about gender identities and age. Asian women have been hypersexualized and objectified since Asians first began immigrating to the US, reflecting old Orientalist stereotypes. The Page Act of 1875 prohibited Chinese women from entering the US because they were seen as prostitutes that would corrupt America. During wars like Vietnam War and Korean War, where there was heavy US military presence in these countries, the demand for Asian sex workers increased and added to the hypersexualization of Asian women. And we see this a lot in the media that we consume. In a lot of classic films or popular culture films, Asian women are depicted using broken English and saying problematic phrases like "me so horny" and "me love you long time," or comedians joking about Asian women having tighter vaginas. And I saw even a lot of people on social media talk about their experiences as Asian women and how they've heard grown men saying these sort of phrases to them even while they were underage girls, straight up minors being told, being sexualized and objectified. So it's impossible to ignore this objectification of Asian women, especially in the context of the Atlanta shootings. According to the police, the killer, Robert Aaron Long, said he targeted the spas because they were, quote, a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate. And given what I just discussed about the hypersexualization of Asian women, this is very explicit language that confirms his motives were racial and gender. And so you see that the same thing that lead to perpetual foreigner syndrome experienced by individuals also leads to a lot more severe consequences like the Atlanta shootings. And to understand the root cause of such horrific events, you need to view it from an intersectional perspective.
Thank you, Jennifer and Jessica, for adding to the discussion there and giving us just a little bit of what you know on model minority and also perpetual foreigner. So I think that the typical format of these talks is now to then open it up for conversation. We don't have Jennifer, Jessica, I can't remember if we came up with prompts for other folks. I know we talked about it, but I think what might be helpful now is if we just open the floor up, and if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat, or just I think you can all unmute yourself, but you can go ahead and do that.
I just want to thank the 3 of you for taking the time to do this, especially taking on the burden of having to educate, and especially when it's such a personal topic. So I just want to say that I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Nick. Dr. Johnson, you're very kind to show up. I know you're super busy as well. Everyone is, and I just appreciate you sharing your thoughts. And it is very personal. You're absolutely right. I didn't think actually I would get emotional, but it is where the spirit took me, and it's because it has been hard. And if you talk to some Asian American students, some may not feel anything. They may have a way of compartmentalizing, and and it's okay. And I pride myself on my ability to do that as well, and I know a lot of my colleagues do as well. But that healing group that I was talking about, these were 70 psychologists, 70 Asian American psychologists all calling in at the same time to heal together. And there wasn't a dry eye, because we all saw ourselves, we all saw our, Lolas and Lolas and, you know, aunties in this. And, our African American brothers and sisters know exactly what this is like, right? With all the anti-Black violence, they know exactly what it's like. Ethnic minorities know what this is like, but when it's so present, it's still so raw. It's hard to process. So if you have students, you know, who need to process, if you're a faculty or staff person, you feel like you can do it, please process it with them. Invite the conversations. I've invited the conversations, and I've had students email me saying, thank you for opening up the space to talk. Because we didn't have that, not in my program, right? Not with our faculty. And I don't know how true that is. I mean, I believe that most people are really giving of their time. Most faculty and staff are really supportive of students. But, that invitation is huge, right? So it takes, if for the allies in the room, like, it's not just about asking, how are you, right? How are you doing? Like, that allyship is built over time, not just over one email inquiry, right? And if you're going to email and ask, or if you're going to phone and ask, don't be afraid of hearing the truth. Don't be afraid of hearing and dealing with the strong emotions, right? Like, allyship it's not just about showing up that one time when, the S hits the fan, right? It being there always. And that's why I so appreciated texts from people like Dr. Johnson and that conversation with Chad Williams, right? Like, because these are people who've consistently showed up, right? That's important. And I know I don't always do a great job of it either. So we're always striving to be better allies. There isn't a perfect ally out there. We just have to strive to be better.
So I want to thank all three of you, Chris and Jen and Jess, for just this incredibly vulnerable heart space, right? Like, I can empathize and identify with experiencing the pain in the heart because you belong to the community, to various communities that are under attack. And then being in a space where you've got to both experience that, but then help other folks gain awareness and educate and talk folks through while you're still in pain. It is such an incredible balancing act. I know I have fallen off myself trying to do that. And so I really do thank all three of you for your ability to do that today. I pose this to all of you. This is important to start the conversation, to have a conversation, to gain an awareness, to show up. But as you talk about that allyship, specifically, Chris, it's not a one-off, right? It is a continual engagement. And so from all three of you, can you suggest, so what do we do after today? So we showed up today, and then what?
I always have a response, but I want to make sure that Jessica and Jen have the space to chat also. Pretty easy for me as a male professor to just jump in and take up oxygen. So Jessica, Jen, I'm going to leave it to you two first, and then I'll jump in.
I think the main thing is just like not being silent about it and speaking up about it. And even if you're not necessarily being the one who's speaking up about it, you know, amplifying the voices that are. And I think that's very important, you know, like even on social media, like which is where I see a lot of this kind of stuff. I think everything has such a short like lifespan on social media. I'll see some stuff like some movement, people will post about it for like 2 days and then it just like disappears and then like nobody talks about it again. So, you know, seeing that kind of stuff is like disheartening, you know, seeing that, you know, people got killed, but like we're only going to talk about it for like a day or two and then let's move on, you know. So seeing that kind of stuff, it is upsetting. So I guess just like continuing to talk about this. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I would agree with Jess. And like, as someone that isn't part of the Asian community, I feel like the best thing to do is like educate yourself in the best way you can. So I know like I was really scared of like, I guess like stepping over people's toes or talking about situations that aren't like personally mine, which is why I stuck more to like quoting other people and like uplifting voices of people that do like actually deal with these situations like personally, because like it's not my story to tell. But I also like on my own just educate myself in the best way I can about like the history of like the model minority myth or like other aspects that are getting shown in the current situation against Asian Americans. And I would also say like bringing these conversations into spaces that aren't like quote unquote meant for them. So like obviously this situation and like this conversation we're having in this space is like necessary, but how many other people are going to hear it if they don't bring themselves to this space? So kind of like bringing it to places that don't always get spoken about.
I also have one more thing that I wanted to add. I think like before the shootings, like there was like the beatings of elderly, there were a lot more microaggressions that came from COVID related like racist attacks. And I think, you know, it's also important to address these like supposedly like little things, you know, the microaggressions, you know, this kind of like dehumanization and the need to like kill people. It doesn't come like overnight, you know, it's constantly like built up from the smaller things, you know, calling you the smaller like racial slurs or like just like microaggressions that like you don't think is important. They add up and they lead to big events like this. And it's important to also call those things out, not just wait for some major traumatic event to happen for you to care about racism. So yeah.
Yeah, I thank you, Jen and Jess. I mean, those are really important. I think thoughts on allyship, and Jen, you know, certainly recognize and appreciate everything that you're doing today and taking time out of your student schedule to prepare some stuff for today for us as an ally. And you know, I think Jess, your point about, you know, hey, it's the everyday stuff. It's not just the big stuff that's important, and that goes for all of our communities, right? It's not just about. And we're talking here today. We're here today to talk about anti-Asian violence, but the issue of allyship cuts across different types of identities, right? And we can all be allies to someone else. I think one of the things to really do is to understand, to kind of expand on Jess and Jen. It's to think a little bit about how white supremacy operates. Those are kind of big, you know, words, and we've been using that on campus. And sometimes I have to really kind of check myself and figure out, like, am I meeting what other people are hearing, and am I meeting what I'm even trying to say, right? But white supremacy, you know, let's just take one part of it. You know, it's this operation from a monoculturalist, monoracialist kind of assumption, right? Like you think everyone operates the same way, you know, that you do. Now, you in this case is white, right? And that it's, but there's so many other different types of experiences, and we need to be able to see where people experience things differently, and then push ourselves to figuring out whether or not and how we might extend ourselves. So one of my colleagues, Grace Caskey, but she was seeing some needs and some issues that they were experiencing. And so she set up a new program, a new way of doing business to support them and their issues. That takes time and effort and resources, right? That's allyship. That's labor that's not recognized and rewarded. But I saw it and I appreciate it because that's something she didn't have to do, right? But she did. And it wasn't done in a paternalistic way either. So that's the other thing that's really important. When you're an ally, don't come at it from this paternalistic perspective that you know best and that what you're saying and what you're doing is the best, right? You have to be humble about it as an ally, and I have to be humble as an ally, you know, to the queer community. Like I have to make sure I keep learning and pushing myself and recognize my flaws, and I have tons, right? So I'm not saying that other people are, that if to be an ally you have to be perfect. You can't, but to push yourself, I think, is what's important. And for the Asian American community specifically, being an ally means getting past any internalization of the model minority stereotype, right? Recognizing that Asian American students, Asian American colleagues and staff have concerns, they have needs, they're not perfect, they're not this model minority, right? That it has costs. That model minority myth has costs on anyone who internalizes it, not just white folks, but anyone. And so to challenge it when you can, to push when you can against that stereotype is important, right? Because we may not extend ourselves to people who might need help if we think that they are not needing of help and support. Chad, I don't know if I don't know if the three of us answered your question.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Choi.
Hey, thank you so much for giving me to speak. So in response to Chad's question, I mean, I could offer my very limited, I don't know, preliminary stab at a solution. And that is, I find myself depending more on my community and just being more vulnerable. That is, I mean, I talk about this with my students. I talk about what we love, and we all essentially love the same things. And I was watching George Floyd's trial this morning and kind of found myself reliving that trauma. So I don't know, collective grieving and collective sharing of our trauma seems to be the only thing that I could do to fight this going forward.
Professor, we can't hear you.
Thank you so much for that. Every meeting, right? Someone does it, and usually it's me. So thank you. Is it Kayla or Kayla?
Yes,
Thank you so much. Kayla, thank you so much for that. I was saying that that my internet broke up a little bit when Dr. Choi was talking, but what the parts that I heard was the beginning part, I believe, and that was like how you found yourself wanting to connect with other people who had similar types of experiences, and that it's hard to hear the traumas, but there's also something that's a little bit comforting about it. This isn't anything that you said, I don't think, but there's something comforting in it. And it's not that, oh, you know, we want to bathe in each other's traumas, right? But it's that we're not alone, we're not isolated. And on this community, in this campus of ours, especially during COVID, boy, it's so easy to feel isolated. All of us have felt isolated this year, but when things like this happen, when there is a racial trauma that affects the community, and if you're a part of that community, you're going to feel a little bit more threatened. If you're a woman and you hear about some type of gender-based violence in the community, you're going to feel it in a different way. You may feel even more isolated if you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and there's something that happens in the community. This is what we're calling vicarious trauma, right? Like we experience it personally. And if you don't have, if you've not lived the experience of having been marginalized, you may not know what vicarious trauma is, right? And so these healing communities, these conversations, these collectives that I value as an Asian American may not make as much sense to you, right? But to someone like me, during the past 2 weeks, those are the people that I've really leaned on. And it's not because I can't get along with white folks or Black people. It's just, boy, they're going to get me and we're going to cry the same ugly tears, right? Like it is the same ugly, and it is like an ugly healing, and it needs to happen. And for me, I don't necessarily feel that comfortable, with that ugly healing in front of people I don't know. And certainly, I think that's a common experience among you all as well. It's hard. And just to speak a little bit about race here, it's a little bit harder to be vulnerable around white folks, right? Because I don't know how they're going to interpret it, right? Like I know my friends, my colleagues who I trust deeply and I love so much, and some of them are on this call, they'll appreciate it and they'll comfort me. And I trust that they're coming from a really good place, but I don't know where other people are coming from because we don't have these real race talks, right? But so Dr. Choi, I anytime you want to chat, let me know. And Sharon, I saw your post and I appreciate the shout out on the PBS special. Super important. We all always have a lot to learn. So many heroes, of different ethnic groups that don't get much play, particularly Asian American heroes. Grace Lee Boggs, one of my own heroes, Yanlia Espiritu, Larry Ilion, two Filipinos that have done so much for our field, so much for this country, and people don't know about it, right? But like they're heroes across the board. Fred Korematsu, who challenged, the 14th Amendment. Like so many people of Asian descent that have done so many good things that we don't know about. And why is that, right? So I would say, I'm appreciative of the fact that we have one Asian American studies in class in on campus. I think when I got here, there wasn't one. And I think that's really nice that we have that. And so I think that's it's a start. And I hope we can have more of those types of courses. But Dr. Choi, thank you so much. And if you ever want to just bond together and connect, let me join your circle. I'll let you join my circle and we can collectively grieve. Thanks.
I just want to quickly point out that the community that I've been depending on include people of all colors, and they love me, regardless of whatever color I am. And I love my sisters and brothers. I don't see the culture or the background or the skin color. So I really, I don't mean to, use this cliche of a post-racial word, but to some extent, within my circle of friends, that just has not been an issue for me. I'm cautiously optimistic that that circle of friends will get bigger and bigger.
I share your optimism. I do. Any other questions or thoughts? Because Jen, Jess, and I do have a question for you all, but any other questions or comments or thoughts from you all?
Well, I had a comment. I think bringing up the model minority standard myth, stereotype is so important no matter what space in this university that you operate, because it is inherently crippling to your personality, to your identity. And then we all see it when you have an inherent natural flaw or you have a shortcoming, it becomes like a public display of discipline. And, you know, time ago, that public display of discipline was either maiming or, you know, or lynching and all of these other things we don't like talking about. But it just makes it so that, at least as me, as a Black person, I feel like I walk around in a cage, unable to fully breathe as my authentic self, because I inherently know in the back of this quote white supremacist mind lies my quote stereotype that someone else is using against me.
I was trying to find the clap function on the Zoom, but I'm just going to do this right here because that is a lot easier. I totally get you. Yeah, boy, that you know, you walk around with this question of, you know, do people assume things, right? So here's an example, because I'm you know, I'm nowhere near post-racial either, Dr. Choi, but I'm certainly about allyship and connecting with people from different racial groups. But quick, funny, maybe not so funny story. It's funny to me. We're heading to the Women's March, my wife and I, 2017 in Philly. And on the train, I get stopped over and over again, right? Oh, you taught my daughter math, or you taught my kids violin. You taught my niece chemistry, right? And you know, these things don't hurt, right? Like I don't get too. I mean, you know, I think I may have played along with one of them. You know, like, oh yeah, how are they doing? They were just a wonderful student. You know, what are you gonna do, right? But like, you know, when I walk into spaces, you don't know what people are assuming, and you know, and I don't know if for, you know, other Asian and Asian American students, because there isn't one experience. I don't dare speak for them, but I know I've talked to some Asian American colleagues. They're like, I worry about my English, right? I worry about how people perceive me and my ability to speak English, because they see me as a foreigner. And so automatically I'm defensive, right? Yeah, definitely, Lori, stereotype threat, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Kayla. Thank you for sharing that. Jessica, Jen, do you have any comments to share? I want to invite you back into the conversation just in case. Okay.
I don't have a comment. I was just gonna say, like, since one of the main things that us three think like is needed for allyship, and just like after this conversation, like I am going to drop like a Google Doc of like the resources that I used to kind of like research about this topic, and also just prepare myself for this talk.
Thank you for that, Jen. You're awesome. Jen, do you want to ask the group the question?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
So in our conversation, we were talking about like discussion questions. So the question I kind of want to pose is, what are your opinions, or what do you think like Lehigh as an anti-racist institution needs to do to show their support for this problem, or just like what is the next step like the Lehigh institution needs to do?
I don't have a comment of what we should do, but I will say that during this year, with all of the unrest and all of the tragedies that have been happening and the incidents, I really miss the campus community. That normally when we have all the students here, there's an immediate reaction, and students are active and they're out, you know, they're leading protests, or there's a march at the University Center. I am really missing that this year because the students are not here. They're not on our campus with us. And how powerful that would have been this year if we had been able to assemble like that.
I agree, Susan. I was kind of imagining that flagpole and us, gathered around it, for sure. Kayla, Lehigh needs a more authentic voice. Do you want to say more about that, or does anyone else want to say more about that?
I just think sometimes when we respond to things, it's almost like it sounds like it's a cut and paste and you're reading what is that called, a teleprompter? And people read right through that, especially people who are marginalized. And I'll say this, I can read the body language, the nuances, and can hear the dog whistles coming from like 5 miles out. So when it's slapped together, it's actually a slap in the face. It's even worse than just not saying anything at all. And sometimes that's how I feel when I look at like emails and I'm like, oh, what is that? Not good. Like, I don't know if anybody else has experienced that, but sometimes I'm like, sorry, I have the kids home.
I think it's really important too that we react as a university faster. I think sometimes there is a delay that happens that is painful.
Yeah, so I think the comment that I wanted to make was separate and apart from, a protest or, a statement, which in my opinion is more performative, one, and two, reactionary. If we think about white supremacy and racism, it goes back to these fundamental practices and policies, right? So it's, what are those practices and policies that have been engendered at Lehigh that continue to marginalize people? That continue to make it painful, difficult, isolating, alienating for people of color to function in a PWI. What are those things that continue to make it so difficult? That adds to the burden of the struggle they're already facing. Those are the things that need to be addressed. So you send out a statement, that's great. And I feel like you're standing with me, but then if in the regular routine of my existence, I feel like I am struggling against this humongous tide, then those statements and those committees don't really redound to much. And that's, in my opinion, it just doesn't, because you feel like you're floundering as a student, because you feel like you constantly have to be sharing this struggle or this burden or begging to be at a table because so many systems and policies and practices are in place that make it more difficult for you to navigate.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for being present today, for sharing your narrative, for sharing your story, for being vulnerable. I know all too well what it's like to be a minority and have to show up and be the educator, right? That's the burden we all have to carry. And there are moments where I don't want to carry that burden, but I think about future generations in the world, or the pathway that I want to create for them. And I echo everything that everyone said today. I think being in higher ed for the last decade, we tend to hop onto action words, to hot items, right? And the thing right now is anti-racism. Everyone's pushing the word and everyone's putting it at the forefront, but I don't see any action step being implemented, and that includes Lehigh. And I agree with the statement about reactionary. Every time something happens in the news, we're very quick to send out a letter, but I don't see any systems changes or systems being put in place that make my life easier, make other people's life easier on this campus. And as a professional, you know, there are times where I can tap out and go home or tap out and go on vacation. But I think about our students that have to be here 10 months out of the year that don't have the outlet, right? I think about students who may want to speak up against a marginalized statement that they heard, but may feel fear in saying something because they're afraid of the action that's going to come from the professor or the scholarship that they may not get for being vocal. So you think about all of those things and the burdens that our students have to carry. And I really truly ask myself the question, does equity really exist for our students? How is a Asian American student or immigrant or first-gen student able to survive and be successful post-Lehigh if they can't matriculate the same way in which their white counterparts can navigate this campus? That's not equity, that's not inclusion, and it doesn't exist here. Those are the systems that we have in place. So I thank you all so much for providing this space. I thank you all for sharing your story. And selfishly, it felt great to not be the one being the educator, but being able to sit back and listen to the narratives that are being shared. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica. And I was masked and talking before and muted. So I just wanted to say, Katie, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing and being open. And Monica, thank you for your thoughts there too. And one of the things that I know we're kind of running short on time, but one of the things that I think a lot about in terms of institutional response, like I want people to know that institutional response doesn't absolve people from their individual responsibility.
Mhm.
Right? Does that make sense? Right? Like, because there's the institution's response, and then we each individually have a responsibility to one another, right? To challenge how we've internalized white supremacy and our own biases, and to unpack it and to be good allies to one another. And now that doesn't mean that the institution doesn't have a responsibility either. It's both and. Because sometimes I hear, you know, sometimes I hear people, faculty in particular, say, well, it's the institution's response. They need to do more, right? And sometimes they're absolutely right. Most of the times they're absolutely right. And sometimes, because I know some of these faculty, right? And I know we're being recorded, but like I know some of these faculty and I know that they are not doing nearly enough, right? And so it's a both and. Yes, institutional response sometimes is too slow, not good enough, you know, and then boy, at the individual level. And it's not just in response to an event, but every single damn day. What are we doing? Right? Every day. And that's the weight, right? Because we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years of white supremacy, right? It's a huge lift from a lot of people that has to happen all the time. It's not just, oh, I'm going to write a nice email and everyone's going to feel good. You know, I can't remember who said it, if it was Monica or Katia. Yeah, stand with you. What does that mean, right? What's the actual stuff? And I have to believe that university is doing something. I hope they are. I'm pretty sure they are, right? But what is the university? What is the institution? Are we talking about big I institution? Are we talking about your departments, your programs, your colleges? Like, what's the level, and what's the level of the individual?
Absolutely. Wow, Chris, thank you so much for all that you have shared with us today. Jen and Jess, really appreciate all three of you for taking the time to being not just vulnerable, but truly authentic with the content that you shared, the personal experiences and suggestions, and allowing all of us to really, really think about these different areas that we can also educate ourselves on, but also work on to be be great allies. We, you know, being here today shows a lot of solidarity, and there's so much more that we can still do on an individual, and as you mentioned, Chris, on an institutional level. So thank you so much for that. Appreciate all of your time and effort for being here. And I do want to mention that we are continuing these conversations throughout this month. This was one of the most impactful ones that I have had the privilege to sit on. And next week, we will also have another Real Talk conversation from one of our OMA ambassadors who will be leading the conversation on debunking immigration myths. So please join us for that. And following that, the following week, we will have our colleagues from CCAR, Community Conversations on Race, coming back to talk some more on how to have difficult conversations with family. So please, all of you, I hope to see you again in this space. And I hope that you all take the time to really process what you heard today, to really think about what are some of those things that you can do on an individual level and continue that education piece for yourselves and for our community. Thank you all again, and I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon.